I'm here today organizing and mobilizing for an accountable, ethical Supreme Court. I'm here with my great friend Cecile Richards, and Maggie Meyer from Pro-Choice Minnesota, and also Alencia Johnson, the amazing Alencia Johnson. So I'm here today because I understand that the Supreme Court is an essential foundation for our democracy and the rule of law. And I understand that it is broken. And when something is broken in our democracy, you can't just turn away. You have to go to work to fix it. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. It is essential in its constitutional role as the final arbiter of justice and protecting the rule of law. And to fulfill that role, it must be trusted by citizens as fair and an ethical judge, calling the balls and strikes, as Justice Roberts once famously said. But today, the Supreme Court has become too powerful and too political, doing the work of extreme right-wing conservatives, anti-choice advocates, and corporate interests. And we saw this with the supermajority of the Supreme Court, put there by a president who did not even win the popular vote, overturned Roe versus Wade, the 40-year constitutional precedent guaranteeing that people would have the freedom to make their own decisions about their own bodies and their own lives. I am the only United States Senator who has ever worked at Planned Parenthood, and in that role, I saw firsthand people walk through the doors of Planned Parenthood clinics ready to make the best decisions for themselves and their families. And yet today, we have extreme right-wing politicians and judges thinking that they know better than these people whose lives and stories they will never know. It is because of this extremism that I have concluded that what we must do is to restore balance to the Supreme Court by adding justice to the Supreme Court. Now, it's important to remember that the Constitution does not describe how many Supreme Court justices that we have. In fact, the Constitution gives to Congress the responsibility for setting the number of Supreme Court justices. So today, Congress needs to take that responsibility. It needs to do the work that the Constitution gives to us to restore balance and an ethical framework to the United States Supreme Court. And that is what I'm very proud to do. I'm one of 3 United States senators who has signed on to this legislation to make that so. We also need to pursue the very important ethical reforms that are needed for the Supreme Court, and in this way restore the balance of power that we must have in this country, and a Supreme Court that is seen and is fair and ethical and responsible. I'm now going to turn to Cecile Richards. Take it away.
Thank you, Senator. Just get this right. Thanks, Senator, not only, for your courage in the Senate, for your many years serving women for Planned Parenthood. We are here today in Minneapolis because the Supreme Court is no longer a source of justice in the United States of America. Women have had their most fundamental freedom stripped away, and frankly, we're living in fear of what might be next. Despite their testimony during confirmation hearings reaffirming their respect for judicial precedent, judges on the Supreme Court overturned nearly 50 years of the right to make our own decisions about pregnancy, a decision that is perhaps the most personal and important of any that we get to make in our lifetime. We didn't lose this right because suddenly it was no longer important. In fact, since the Roe decision, abortion services in America are not only medically safe, 1 in 4 women in this country will have an abortion at some point in her lifetime. We didn't lose this right because the American people changed their minds. In fact, support for Roe versus Wade and the right to legal abortion has never been higher. We lost this right because members of the court, 3 of whom were put on by Donald Trump and jammed through by Senate Republicans, these justices decided that their own political and religious views were more important than the health and well-being of women. The political backlash has been severe, and the personal toll on American women has been enraging. In state after state, voters have overwhelmingly reaffirmed their desire to live in a country that respects this most basic freedom, and yet this Supreme Court seems to be above the will of America. Women across the country are being denied life-saving medical care because of the Dobbs decision. Doctors are being threatened with jail, with criminal prosecution, and it's no longer safe to be a pregnant person in most of America. In my home state of Texas, women continue to come forward, including most recently Amanda Zarowski. Amanda was only able to receive an emergency abortion after she went into septic shock. And it is unclear now that she'll ever be able to actually have a healthy pregnancy in the future. This is 100% a result of the Dobbs decision. This Supreme Court is holding America hostage. And of course, just recently, Justice Alito was prepared to end access to medication abortion for all women in America because, in his words, it was not shown that they were likely to suffer irreparable harm. That's how little he understands or cares about our health or our futures. And we know from Justice Thomas's opinion in Dobbs that freedom to make our own decisions about pregnancy is just the beginning. Justice Thomas seems prepared to revisit other longstanding rights in America, including the right to birth control. This cannot stand. Every part of our democracy is at stake. Our right to control our bodies, our right to be safe from rampant gun violence, our right to vote and have fair representation. This court is tainted by unethical behavior, as Senator Smith has referred to, from the lack of financial disclosure to Justice Thomas's wife, her involvement in efforts to subvert our democracy and overturn a presidential election. It is beyond time to reform the court so that we can restore the faith of the American people and advance justice and equality. And that is why we were here today. This is not a tomorrow thing. This is a today thing. People's lives are at stake. Women's lives are at stake. So the time to act is now. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce Maggie Meyer, the ED of Pro-Choice Minnesota.
Hi, I'm Maggie Meyer. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Executive Director of Pro-Choice Minnesota. I personally am so proud to call Minnesota home. We are a state that is we are the best state to raise a family in the upper Midwest because we have decided time and again to protect women's rights and pregnant people's rights to have an abortion. Minnesota had spent the last year, and especially this past legislative session, making great gains for pregnant people in Minnesota. Just this past year, we passed the Protect Reproductive Options Act, the PRO Act, which codified the right to an abortion in our state. It was the very first act that our legislators and governor signed into law this year. Last year, we elected the first ever pro-choice majority pro-choice majority in the Senate, forming the first ever pro-choice trifecta in our state. After the Dobbs decision, Minnesotans were angry, and they turned out. They turned out, and we have made historical gains because of it. We also passed the RFDA, the Reproductive Freedom Defense Act, protecting our providers who are already providing abortions to people coming in from out of state. In my role as an executive director, I don't work for an abortion clinic, but time and again, people call me and they say, hey, I know a 12-year-old who needs an abortion and they live in Texas. What do I do? I know a 13-year-old in Wisconsin. They need an abortion. What do I do? This is not a tomorrow problem, like Cecile said. This is already happening here in Minnesota. And our clinics are already seeing more than 100% increase in the patients coming from out of state. We've also spent a lot of time working on accessibility in our budget so that in Minnesota, your access to abortion and to reproductive health care will not be defined by your zip code, by your income, by your race, or your gender. But all of that could be taken away, and it could be lost, and that fate is in the hands of just a few people at the top in the Supreme Court. They do not represent us, we do not vote for them, and they do not represent the interests of the pro-choice majority in Minnesota. Thank you. And it's my pleasure to introduce Alencia Johnson.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Thank you all so much for being here. And I am so grateful that we are here in Minnesota talking about this with a champion of the Judiciary Act, because that is such a bold move to come from our Senate. I, too, had the honor of spending 6 years working at Planned Parenthood with Cecile Richards. And the things that I saw traveling across the country, women and people who wanting to already then get their right to an abortion, they already face so many challenges. And I remember the dark day about a year ago when the Dobbs decision, before it was even actually a decision that we knew the Supreme Court made, when the leak came out, there were so many women in this country who were scared. Women of all backgrounds. But as a black woman, I can't stand here and not talk about the plight that my sisters are going through in the country that is the wealthiest in the world. And yet, black women continue to die at higher rates in childbirth than any other demographic of women in this country. And that is directly related to our healthcare system. That's directly related to reproductive health care, including abortion care. We're talking about the Dobbs decision and overturning Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. The reality is there's a significant impact through all of the decisions that the Supreme Court is going to make, whether it is gun control, because people deserve to live in communities that are free from violence, not just parents, but people who are thinking about having children in a country where, unfortunately, the #1 killer of children is gun control. Black people and young people are fighting for our rights to vote when, unfortunately, the Supreme Court is about to decide on that as well. Immigration, affirmative action, the list goes on and on and on. And unfortunately, we have justices who are bought by billionaires, as everyone else here has alluded to. They would rather fly on planes and have lovely cocktails and talk about taking away the rights of the people than actually do the will of the people. I can continue to talk about the dark days that are immediately ahead as we are fighting for change, but I want to give us a little bit of hope. The reality is, well, unfortunately, majority of Americans have lost faith in the Supreme Court, but that gives me an opportunity. That gives me a little bit of optimism that majority who was frustrated with the Supreme Court is standing right here with us. There's more of them and less, there's more of us and less of them, and we are coming for them in these elections. We are going to show up. We are not going to stand for this because the will of the people will prevail. And I'm honored to stand here with these activists who are doing it every single day on the ground, and we will make sure that not only rights are restored in this country, that ethics are restored to the Supreme Court. We will expand the Supreme Court, and we will actually make this country what it was envisioned to be, full of opportunity and justice for every person, and that should be enshrined into the Constitution. I'm going to turn this back over to Senator Smith. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate my colleagues so much being here today, and we would now be happy to answer any questions that any of you have. Well, so in order to fix our reproductive freedom problem, we need to fix our democracy problem. And a key part of that is to, in my view, is to end the filibuster in the United States Senate. We also need to pass voting rights reforms, and we need to reform the Supreme Court. So this means we need to win elections. And that is where the power of people's voices in this moment, particularly on this issue of reproductive freedom, is so meaningful and is so powerful. We saw this in 2022 where, Minnesotans and in races across the country, Americans said, I do not want politicians and judges making decisions for me about my reproductive system and about my family and my life. And the reason that we're gathered here today is to help explain and help people to understand the power of their voices to make a difference. That needs to be expressed in our elections so that we have the votes in the United States Senate to end the filibuster, to do the work to expand the Supreme Court, restore balance to the Supreme Court, and I would also say pass voting rights laws. Well, so the by all appearances, the ethical lapses of Judge Thomas, the way in which he has accepted gifts from a billionaire who is also simultaneously funding dark money operations, the way in which his spouse, Ginny Thomas, has also financially benefited from the largesse of not only this billionaire, but also other forces in dark money, the way in which his spouse has actively participated in the efforts to overthrow the voice of the people in our free and fair elections is stunning. I am equally stunned that the United States Supreme Court, which has said that it is capable of policing itself when it comes to ethics, seems to not be able to take any action here. Yeah. Well, again, elections are really the key issue here. I don't need to tell you that the current status of the United States House of Representatives would tell us that we have no hope of doing anything to address legislatively or through the body of Congress what to me seem to be the egregious ethical lapses of Justice Thomas. And that's why today we are here talking about legislation. I will tell you that I've signed on, we're here to talk about elections and building power for this. I will tell you that there is legislation which I have signed on to, which would require the Supreme Court to live by the judicial code of conduct that other federal judiciary members have to live by. Congress should not be required to take that step. It should be obvious that that's what the Supreme Court should do. But that's one step we could take. Anybody else want to comment?
Well, I was just one thing I think is maybe not completely germane to that question, but for decades the Republican Party has made the Supreme Court has rung that bell and gotten their voters to come out because of the Supreme Court. I think as Democrats or just as normal Americans, we always thought the Supreme Court was above politics. But now, because of all, what has happened over the last few years, that is no longer true. And it is important that Democrats, and why I'm so grateful to Senator Smith and some of her colleagues, we have to make the American people aware of the fact that the Supreme Court is broken and that these elections impact who goes on to the courts and who goes on to the federal judiciary. And I just think that some people think we're late to the game. I just think we had a stronger belief in the system and in the importance of a judiciary that was apolitical, but we're not there anymore.
Well, let me just take a stab at that, and then I can't help but just acknowledge that progress is not a straight line. It zigs and zags back and forth, and progress happens because of the willingness of Americans to make their voices heard and to speak out on this issue. So I think our first step is for people to come to an understanding that there is something that as citizens and as Americans we can do to restore balance to the court and to help people to understand that this 9-justice number is not set in law. In fact, the number of Supreme Court justices has gone up and down over the history of this country. And then second step, of course, is to win elections and to also persuade our colleagues that this is something reasonable that we can do to return a balance and also a sense of integrity to a Supreme Court that we so desperately need to be above the law. Or fair and just, not above the law, complying with the law. But others, I think. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. Right. Well, of course, part of the decision in Dobbs alluded to the fact that this is really an issue. The issue of pregnancy should somehow be a state's issue, which is, of course, absurd because, as many of my colleagues have said,
your right to make a decision about your pregnancy shouldn't depend on your zip code. But that was the idea of the majority on the court. But now, of course, we're seeing immediately, not even a year later, efforts by the Republican Party to pass a national abortion ban, and most recently, the case that will eventually probably make its way back to the court is a national ban on medication abortion. So anytime that we believe there are some rights that we actually have, they all seem to be easily traded away. I also want to say, something that I think Senator Smith said is really important. You got to hope that at least the Supreme Court also reads the newspaper. And the first state after the Dobbs decision to vote with their feet on this issue was the state of Kansas, where an effort to ban abortion in that state was soundly defeated, not by Democrats, but by Democrats, independents, Republicans, young people, whatever measure. This is not popular in the United States of America, and we saw in the 2022 elections not only these important state races, but all 5 states where abortion was literally on the ballot through ballot initiatives. Every single one, regardless of whether it was a red state or a blue state, voted in favor of abortion rights. So at some point, I hope, too, that this Supreme Court recognizes they are not above the will of the people. They are not above the rights of people in this country to make fundamental personal decisions. And folks are angry, and folks are organizing.
I want to add something to the piece about the obstacles as well and how we got here. Some people do think that this happened overnight. But when Roe was decided, that is when conservatives said, we are going to attack the courts. That took over 40 years, almost 50 years. And so we have to remember, particularly the people, particularly voters, this isn't going to change overnight. But what we can do is build off this momentum that people have felt. And it didn't become real until the Dobbs decision, but we saw them chipping away at our rights when they gutted a key provision of the Voting Rights Act. But a lot of people who aren't as close to this work as some of us are didn't believe that it would be real or that it would manifest in their lives. The Dobbs decision made that very real for people within a week. And so it's going to take some time. It's going to take a lot of elections, and this is also why they are going after voting rights, because they know the will of the people is the opposite of what they believe. But again, I'm encouraged by this polling, not just because people see that the Supreme Court needs reforming. It means that the people understand the point of the Supreme Court. They're realizing I can elect pro-choice candidates up and down the ballot, local, state, and federal. They can pass all of this legislation to expand and protect my rights, and yet these Supreme Court justices can overturn all of that, right? And I finally believe that there are so many people who are on the side of that, and there are so many people I think that we have seen, and I'm so glad that you mentioned all of these state wins that we've seen. People know that it's more than voting. It's voting and holding people accountable and putting the pressure on the people that they have elected to represent them. And that's what gives me hope that people understand their power, and they're going to stay in this fight for as long or even longer than it takes.